local populations of Indians and Chinese. So it might be that the assumption is that they're South African, even though they're not black, and that might provide some semblance of protection in these instances. But I also think that there are all kinds there have been all kinds of attempts to understand the outbreaks of xenophobic violence in South Africa in 2009, and sporadic episodes of violence before and since that. And while there have been a handful of Chinese victimized, it was almost kind of, they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. They weren't the actual targets. And I've been trying to understand that as well. And I think part of some of the explanations have to do with the same thing that I mentioned, the way I understand what's going on in Lesotho, and it's the aspect of competition. Whether it's real or perceived, there's the sense that, especially amongst the most impoverished black South Africans, that other black Africans are coming in and stealing their RDP houses and stealing resources, and it comes down to stealing their women, right? Which is kind of the most kind of very controversial but almost visceral kind of reaction that you can get. And the Chinese don't threaten. The Chinese in South Africa are never threatened in that way. I think the Chinese in South Africa, certainly in Johannesburg, have been very quick to learn. So during the course of my research, at the very beginning, when I was finishing up my PhD and starting to look at these communities of new migrants, there were incidents in 1998, 99, 2000 of Chinese street hawkers in downtown Johannesburg. They would come in and set up on street corners. The Chinese didn't realize that there was a street hawking association that allocated special corners to special people, that there was a system in place. And there was, in fact, quite a lot of tension over a period of few months. The Chinese seem to learn quickly from this experience, and they have removed themselves, at least in Johannesburg. They no longer engage in retail trade. The Chinese are all based in those wholesale distribution outlets. And so they will sell retail there, but mostly they sell wholesale to other African traders. So they've kind of removed themselves from direct competition, at least in Johannesburg, and that seems to have kind of addressed it. And any Chinese who come in afterwards, like they don't engage in that kind of direct competition. And I think that's one explanation we might look at. I also think that, like I said, the historic kind of relations. It was funny when I started doing these interviews, and I've had some kind of funny anecdotes along the way, but one of the students who was working with me at University of Johannesburg, I had him participate in a panel about kind of local perceptions of Chinese, and he said, hey, the Chinese, he says, when I was growing up, you wanted to be Bruce Lee, the South Africa got television and movies quite late. I think it was only in 1976 that they first started kind of having access to regular television. And one of the kind of movies and themes that was kind of constant, there were spaghetti westerns, and there were all of these kind of kung fu karate movies. And so I think even if one can talk about historical memory or one's kind of predispositions that are formed by early images, there's this sense that, wow, Chinese are cool, Chinese can do martial arts. And so that was, what Tapiwa was saying, that was one of his first memories of a Chinese person. And the other one, like I said, is the Chinese shopkeeper, around the corner who sold to you. And so these are familiar faces, and as I said before, in South Africa, there doesn't seem to be a predisposition to want to hate, unless there's a particular experience. And I have talked to Chinese black South Africans who've worked in factories, and they despise the Chinese. Chinese are horrible about their labor policies, they exploited black South African women. They pay low wages. There were some horrible stories that came out around 1999, 2000 as well about some of the abuses that were taking place in some of these factories. And so, if there was a personal experience of a bad, a personal negative experience with the Chinese, then, certainly there you understand. But it's interesting when I go and do some of these interviews and research with people because of my face, and it's kind of like, a moment of let's see what she has to say, and where she's coming from, and I think that's I found that the South Africans were willing to give the benefit of the doubt, were willing to take in kind of different factors, but for some reason with regard to other black African foreigners, the attitude was very, very different, and I haven't studied that enough, but it's very clear to me that there's a serious problem there, and I don't think you can only explain it with notions of competition. And kind of liberal democracies. I think the difference that they're pointing out is the difference in the development model and the way in which China has developed itself over the last 30 years. And it's in some ways the argument of having a strong developmental state and state-controlled kind of processes rather than looking at kind of the neoliberal, kind of market-driven capitalist system. So it's not saying that China's not, China says this as well about itself, right? It's now capitalist with Chinese characteristics. I met a Cuban woman at a conference in Beijing, and I said, how does China compare? I mean, you're coming from one communist system to another communist system. And she looked at me and she said, China is not communist. There's nothing communist about what I see here in Beijing. So I think that's the real difference. They're pointing to a difference in kind of development models and looking at the possibilities of having a strong developmental state, perhaps a more authoritarian state, and not just China, but at the East in general, the kind of tiger or dragon kind of countries, and the ways in which they were able to develop their countries rather rapidly with the centrally kind of driven models rather than kind of opening itself up to market forces and trade the way the World Bank and IMF have been pushing African countries to do. So that's my understanding.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was
2000. And then we lived in Kenya for 3 years, and then we moved back to South Africa. At the end of that first 5 years, I wrote a small piece with a writing group that I was working on, trying to do something slightly more creative than my dissertation. And I ended up expanding it a little bit, and it ended up being published in Amerasia, which is the journal out of the UCLA Asian American Studies Center. And it was reflecting on my own identity as an Asian American living in Africa. And it used kind of notions of ethical identity, and kind of really reflected on Asian Americans and Asian American identity here. But it's your last comment kind of made me think about that, because in South Africa, before I moved to South Africa, I thought I was going to be a Latin Americanist, and I speak fluent Spanish, and I've lived in Mexico and Costa Rica. So when I was in Mexico, it was funny because from behind, I could be a Mexican. As soon as I turned around, I was chinita, right, a Chinese. And as soon as I opened my mouth, the most important kind of part of my identity, it's like gringa. I'm an American. That was the most cogent, kind of significant part of who I was to a Mexican person. Okay. In South Africa, I've been called white, which shocked the hell out of me, having grown up here. I've been called Chinese, and I could scream till I'm blue in the face and try to explain that I'm Korean American, but that's meaningless to them because there's just no previous experience. There's, it doesn't mean anything. So you're right. And when I explained that I'm from Korea, they say exactly what you said. Oh, so what part of China is that? So, I jokingly say that I moved back to the U.S. about a year ago, and I've recently become Korean American again after being Chinese for many years. Your question about South Africans and their lack of understanding about kind of their position on the continent and in terms of kind of the ethnography, I think your point is very well taken. I mean, I think South Africa is incredibly fraught, and because of apartheid and because of their particular experience with colonialism before that, it's been a very, very isolated country. South Africa, in some ways, is African, but it's not. I don't want to make too much of kind of South African exceptionalism, but I think there are many ways in which it is quite different from the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the kind of nations that were formed by immigration, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. South Africa is amongst those, really, except they weren't able to get rid of the Africans there. And the Africans also have very little understanding that, all of the Bantu people migrated to South Africa from elsewhere, right? So on the one hand, at least when Thabo Mbeki was president, there was this nod to African Renaissance and Pan-Africanism and kind of, it was a lot about his ego, but the role of South Africa on the continent and being part of Africa. And I don't know that Zuma has those same aspirations, and certainly with the kind of nationalist youth kind of faction within the ANC gaining dominance, there's probably going to be less and less willingness to engage in those ways. And I think it's something that South Africa is going to struggle with. If they want to be kind of Africa's representative on the Security Council, they're going to have to get their identity straightened out. They're going to have to appreciate that they are part of Africa and what that means for the way they treat the African migrants in that country. Because up to now, it's been appalling. It's been quite appalling.
We have time for about one more quick question or two quick questions. Yes, and then.
Hi there. My name is Deep. Benjamin Bashar.
not done any research myself on Zambia, but as part of this kind of bigger project on mobilizations of anti-Chinese sentiment, a couple of my colleagues have done quite extensive research in Zambia. And I recently hosted a colloquium at Rhodes University in South Africa, and flew in another young woman who's doing her PhD research on Chinese in Zambia. And so she reported back having had the opportunity to actually sit with Michael Sata and several former presidents of Zambia and interview them about these issues. Michael Sata has been kind of given a lot of airtime in the Western English language media as kind of the African, the only African who's kind of stood up to China. And I find it really interesting because after he was elected and it was announced that he had won the presidency, and this was the third time that he has run, that he was finally successful. The first meeting that he had was with the Chinese ambassador, right? And the way that it was spun in the press was that he was giving the Chinese ambassador a talking to about, if you're going to stay in this country, you're going to do things our way. That was the way that it was presented. One might also sit back and think, who was the first person he met with? What's the most important relationship that Zambia has with another foreign country? It's China, okay? In terms of public opinion, in the previous presidential election, Michael Sata didn't win the national elections, but he did win the two areas around the Chambishi mines in the Copper Belt and around the capital in Lusaka. And in Zambia, if I were going to include them in this kind of presentation, those are the two sites of tension around the mines and in retail in Lusaka. And actually, I might add a third is the whole question about Chinese involvement in agriculture in Zambia. And in those two areas where there has been a lot of anti-Chinese kind of sentiment, he won. And he won because in the first two elections, the only kind of campaign promise that he made was, if I get into power, I will kick the Chinese out. How many people in the room think he's actually going to do that? I mean, what was interesting to me is in the course of this research on mobilizations of anti-Chinese sentiment, we've talked to opposition leaders in 6 different African countries. And while on the face of it, all of them are quite vocal in their criticisms about China, if you dig a little bit, what they're actually saying is they don't like the way the current government is relating to China, and they don't like the fact that the current government is not protecting the rights of the people, right? So it's not necessarily about China, but it's about what the government is or is not doing for the people of its country. And all of the opposition people said, look, we can't cut off relations with China. We'd never be able to do that. If we get into power, we're going to have to play with them because they're the biggest player on the block right now. But if we get into power, we'll do things differently. We will ensure that there are laws, ensure that those laws are implemented, ensure that their labor laws are in place, that workers' rights are protected, that environmental rights are protected, that there is what is it called? In terms of mineral resources and things like that, that there are processes of adding value before we just ship things out, those kinds of things. And so they're very big about talking about these things, but no one's in a position to be able to say we're no longer going to deal with China. And I think that's very, very clear. The other part of your question had to do with about Chinese public opinion about Africa or Africans, and I'm actually the convener and coordinator of a research working group, and we now have about 120 members across the globe of people who do research on either different Chinese populations in Africa or on Africans in China. And one of the reasons we set it up this way is that we wanted to start trying to be able to do comparisons across, and it's really interesting the way some of the racialized perceptions of both Chinese in Africa as well as Africans in China are so similar. And there are lots of complaints lately about from Africans in China, and again, the numbers are quite fluid because it's not clear whether there's a kind of stable African population mostly in Guangdong province, but there are clearly kind of at least 100,000 Africans who are making China their home at least part-time, and there are growing numbers of Africans who are trading. And in fact, a lot of the literature kind of is indicating now that most of the Chinese-made goods that are brought into Africa now aren't brought in by Chinese, but are brought in by other Africans. So there are there are Nigerian, Ghanaian, Senegalese traders who are filling up containers of goods, every month, and sending them to their home country, and they are kind of influencing design, kind of sizing and design and things like that. There are all kinds of controversies. I know in Ghana there's one PhD student who's looking at all of the tensions and controversies around African textiles and what's truly African and what's China made. And is this about and turning this whole debate about China-made goods into a nationalist question. If you're a true Ghanaian, if you're proud, it's almost like be proud, be Ghanaian, buy Ghanaian, right? Made. But the Chinese textiles are a lot cheaper, maybe by half, and so a lot of Ghanaians are choosing to buy China-made. So there are all of these kinds of issues, and it's very clear that China as well China has never been a country to receive immigrants. China, like Lesotho, is a country of out-migration. And we're talking 35 to 37 million Chinese living outside the borders of China. So China doesn't have policies to deal with kind of an immigration on this long-term basis, and so they're also struggling. In fact, I was invited to participate in a conference with I think it was the ministry that was working on rewriting or kind of discussing immigration policy, and looking at the U.S. and Canada and different kinds of immigration policy to try to, come to grips with what's happening now. Because as China becomes more powerful, it's receiving a lot more migrants, not just from Africa, but from all over. There are hundreds and thousands of students from Korea, from Japan, immigrants from Southeast Asia that are all coming in to South China. So anyway.
I want to take one last question and just a comment if Dr. Cham has any wrap-up comments to make. So your question, quick response, and then Dr. Cham.
Yeah, you spoke about